In this video, we're going to be talking about composition in landscape photography. Now, it kind of goes without saying that a good composition can really elevate your photos from being just simple snaps of landscapes to being truly spectacular photos. Before you take your photo, it's worth just spending a little bit of time with the camera off the tripod, just framing up the best composition you can find. And often just dropping the camera down to ground level or moving it a couple of feet to the left or a couple of feet to the right can make all the difference in getting the best composition. Composition in landscape photography can be quite confusing, but luckily there's a few key rules which we frequently fall back on when taking landscape photographs. So in this video, what I'm going to do is take you through 5 landscape photography compositional rules that you can follow when taking your photos, and they're really useful things just to have in the back of your mind when you're trying to formulate your compositions to help you get some great landscape images. So what I'm going to do is take you through a few of the images which I've taken over the last year or so, which I think highlight some of these compositional rules quite nicely. So the first image I wanted to show you is this one, which was actually one of the earliest, I guess, more serious landscape photographs which I took when I was first starting out. And this is an image of the bothy right at the end of Loch Stack up in northwest Sutherland with Ben Arkle in the background. And this image here is a really good demonstration of one of the most frequently used rules of composition, which is called the rule of thirds. Now in the rule of thirds, essentially what we do, if I can just use the crop tool here in Photoshop to show you, is we divide the image into 3 vertical thirds and then 3 horizontal thirds. And we do that using the vertical and horizontal lines. And actually the point where these lines cross can be a really good position at which to locate the focal point of your image. So what I could have done here is I could have had the bothy right in the centre of the image like so. But the trouble with doing that is essentially your eye is drawn to the bothy, but then there's nowhere else for it to go within the image. So in my opinion, I think the image just doesn't work so well with the bothy in the centre. By having it dropped down at the convergence point of a rule of thirds, what this does is it means that your eye is drawn to the bothy first of all, but then there's room for it to move within the photo as well. So for instance, it can follow the line of the loch here up towards the left, and then it can take in the mountains, and then it can just have a bit of a break from looking at the bothy and then come back to the bothy later. And that's essentially how this rule of thirds works, is it helps you to create a bit more space in your image for the eye to move around. Now the rule of thirds is actually based on a ratio known as the golden ratio, and in Photoshop we actually have this as an option when we use our cropping tool. And as you can see, it's a very similar rule. Again, the bothy is positioned at the crossing point in the golden ratio, but essentially what the golden ratio is it's a ratio which occurs throughout the natural world. Our brains are very in tune to recognizing when this ratio crops up, and it's something that we find aesthetically pleasing. So the principle of a ratio is that we've divided the image into rectangles, and the smallest rectangle here in the centre, the proportion between the smallest rectangle and the next largest rectangle, that's this one in the corner, is the same as the proportion of this rectangle and the whole image. Now obviously that's something that can be quite difficult to visualize when you're out in the field, and so that's why it's become simplified to become the rule of thirds, which is just much easier to work with from a practical point of view. And often many cameras will let you set the rule of thirds grid over the back of your live view function, and this can be a real help when you're out in the field trying to compose your shots, because it lets you actually, whilst you're out there, position your focal point on the rule of thirds. Now the rule of thirds can also be really useful where, for instance, you have a very strong horizon in your image, and that's exactly what I've done here in this image which I've taken at Anse Lazio in the Seychelles. I positioned the horizon exactly on that top third line, and this just helps to break the image up nicely into those thirds. And again, the line of the water here also sits on the bottom third quite nicely. The second compositional rule which I wanted to talk about is also present in this image, and this is the use of lead-in lines. Now, a lead-in line is a line that draws you into the image, and it can be anything from a man-made structure such as a wall or a road, or what I like to do is I like to try and have natural features creating those lead-in lines. In this case, we have a line that's created by the blur in the movement of the water, and it's actually creating an S-curve that draws the viewer's eye up towards the setting sun. Now, lead-in lines are fantastic things to look out for, and you can use either man-made structures such as a wall or a road or a path, or in my opinion it's always nice to find naturally occurring lead-in lines. So for instance, that can be movement in the water like this, or the curve of a coastline. And S-shaped lead-in lines are one of the best ones to look out for because they just create this really nice line of sight that draws you up for your image. So a good example of this was also found here in this image of the Mer de Glace glacier, which I took during the shooting of the video from the French Alps. And as you can see, this glacier just draws the viewer's eye up through the image towards the valley at the back, and S-shaped curves are always something that you should be looking out for. As I mentioned, lead-in lines can also be created from, for instance, the shape of the coastline. So in this case, in Acadia National Park, we had the actual curve of the coastline that created a really nice lead-in line that draws the viewer's eye up towards the cliff in the background. Lead-in lines also often work best when they go from the left of your photo over to the right of the image. And the reason for this is that, when we read a page, our eye is used to scanning from left to right. And so if you can get your lead-in line to be moving from left to right rather than from right to left, then that can always be a help as well. The third compositional tool I wanted to talk about is known as the rule of odds. Now, with the rule of odds, essentially this applies where you have multiple subjects in your image. So it's always best to go for, 1, 3, or 5 subjects rather than just 2. And this image here, which we took in the Alps, is quite a nice demonstration of that. So as you can see, this image is obeying the rule of thirds quite clearly. You've got the image divided into the sky, the mountains, and then the woodland below, so it's divided nicely horizontally into thirds. We also have these 3 mountains here which divide the image into vertical thirds as well. So it's actually a really good demonstration of the rule of thirds. But also, because we've got these 3 mountains, the eye doesn't get bored looking at this image. It can look at one mountain, then it will maybe move over to a second mountain, and then it's got a third mountain over here to bounce back to. Now, if I was just to take the image of 2 mountains like here, in my opinion, this image just wouldn't work quite so well. The eye would just be bouncing about between these 2 mountains, and so it would quickly become quite bored. However, by having 3 mountains, you just add that extra element, which can just help keep the viewer's interest in the image for longer. So always try and aim for either 1 subject, 3 subjects, or 5 subjects. Try to avoid just having 2 features that the eye will soon get bored of. Now, the next rule of composition I wanted to talk about is the use of triangles in your image. Now, this is an image that I took of Mont Blanc, and I think that one of the reasons this image works so well is because it has these naturally occurring triangles in it. And the use of triangles in images is actually something which was talked about by Tom Mason, who's a wildlife photographer. I'll put a link to his vlog here, because he uses triangles an awful lot in his wildlife images. And what he says about triangles is that by dividing your image up into triangles, it creates these lines that the eye can follow around in the image, so that it's constantly able to move about and find interest in new areas in your image. It's a really great vlog, so I highly recommend that you check it out, even if you're not interested in wildlife photography. But I think that the same principle applies in landscape photography as well. And in this image, I think one of the reasons why this image works so well is because you have these triangles. So there's this dark triangle created by the rocks here in the lower part of the image, and then there's another triangle created here by the shoulder of the mountain, and then with the line of these rocks and the line of the summit of the mountain, we have another triangle in the image here. And so the eye is drawn around the image by the lines of these triangles, and I think that's why this image works so well. So triangles are another thing to keep an eye out for when you're composing your images. This image of Traphan is another example of an image which uses triangles in it to a large degree. So obviously the mountain itself is triangular. We also have this lead in line that's created by the wall, which is drawing the viewer's attention up towards the summit of the mountain. But also the mountain itself is divided into two further triangles, because we've got one side of it which is catching the light here, and we've got the other side of it which is in dark. And so we have those two triangles as well. But then the mountain itself is dividing the background into triangles. So we also have two triangles in the background here as well. So there's multiple triangles in this image, and I think that that's why this image works. Now the peak of the mountain itself actually isn't obeying the rule of thirds. I've gone for a more central composition, which is often something to be avoided, but I have sighted it slightly off center, so it's slightly to the right, and we've got the sun coming, sort of a faint ray of light that comes in from the left here. And I think actually with this symmetrical shape of the mountain, in this case, this was a good example of when it's sometimes a good idea to break rules. And by breaking the rule of thirds here, I think that this actually makes quite a striking image. Now in this final image, which is an image of Mount Snowdon, this is a good example of the final tip which I wanted to cover in this video, and that is the use of a strong foreground interest. So in this case what I've done is I've dropped the camera down slightly lower to catch this boulder here and have this really quite close to the camera. And by having this strong element of foreground interest in the image, what it does is it creates a sense of depth in the image. Now this is also an image which I wanted to show because it obeys a few of the other rules as well. So you've got the strong foreground interest here. We also have the slope of a hill that's creating a bit of a lead-in line that draws the viewer's eye up through the image, and also this hill itself is creating a triangle in the image. But then Mount Snowdon itself, which is in the background here, that is obeying the rule of thirds, and it's sat at that intersection in the top right-hand corner of the image. So by using these different elements, what we've managed to do is create an image that's got an overall pleasing aesthetic, and is using multiple rules of composition to help draw the eye through the image and maintain the viewer's interest. So I hope you found this video useful. Now, composition is a very subjective subject, so there are times when it might be a good idea actually to break these rules to create really striking images. But it's always useful to have these rules in the back of your mind when you're out in the field taking images, because it can really help you to get those great compositions when you're out there. So if you like this video, please remember to subscribe, please hit like. We've got some more tutorials coming up in this series, so we'll see you soon. Take care.